Hi, everyone. Welcome to Palestinians Podcast, a live episode with Faisal Saleh, the founder of Palestine Museum U.S. And as you can see, we're in the Palestine Museum in Woodbridge, Connecticut. And many of you got to vote on the mural of your choice. That's the backdrop here today. And the votes were actually quite close between the two murals, but ultimately the Rachel Corrie Memorial was the one that won. So we're happy to be sitting here in the museum. I'm so glad to be with you today. Thank you for having me at the museum. And what we'd really like to do is to get to know you a little bit better. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your where you grew up, where you were born, your childhood, just to start us off here.
Thank you, Nadia. And first of all, I'd like to welcome our audience in Palestine and the diaspora. And I'd also like to welcome friends of Palestine around the world. Welcome to the Palestine Museum U.S. So to start with, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. Apologize for our Arabic-only speaking friends. Unfortunately, we need to be talking in English this time. Hopefully, in future episodes, we can do those in Arabic as well. I was born in the town of Al-Bire in 1951 in a one-room dwelling that my family had rented from a local lady in Al-Bire. Her name was Yasser. And it was part of a small house. That house was next to the old post office in Al-Bire. And that was between the post office and the police station across from the flour mill, which was owned by Yaqub al-Rafidi. This is for people who my age who may remember where all those places were in Al-Bire. My family originally comes from the village of Salama, which is just outside of Jaffa. And in 1948, they were refugees. And they moved around originally to a town near Nablus called Silat al-Tahir. Then they spent about 3-4 months in Amman and eventually settled in Al-Bire. My father, who spoke English, was able to get a job with the with the International Red Cross. And once the Red Cross wound down its operations, he also managed to get a position with the civil service with the Jordanian government that took over at that point. So I grew up in the early 50s, and I remember my early childhood. We changed houses a couple of times, and the next house was a house on the Nablus Road, Al-Bire. And I started going to school. I went to the Ubadah ibn Samit Elementary School, and after that I went to Al-Bire Al-Jadida School, which was near Mukhayyam Al-Amari.
If I can just stop you just to ask you a little bit about your experience
Sure.
in those schools. Would you say that you had sort of a normal school experience?
It was normal for Palestinians. And as you know, Palestinian parents put a lot of pressure on their children to perform. And luckily, I managed to meet the requirements, and I scored first in my class. From first grade until the 11th grade when I left for the United States. Every single term, and the year was 2 terms, I had to come up with grades that were the highest among everybody in my class. And if I didn't do that, it was like failing miserably in my whole life. So that just gives you an idea of the kind of pressure some Palestinian parents put on their children, which everything I'm going to tell you about is really, my story is not that much different than millions of Palestinians. We all have the same story. A lot of us were refugees, and we grew up with hardly anything. And somehow, somewhere, we managed to go to school, we went to college, and we overachieved like most Palestinians do. So after the elementary school, I went to the Ramallah Preparatory School, Madrasat Ramallah Al-I'dadiyya, and then Madrasat Ramallah Al-Thanawiyya, and finally Al-Madrasa Al-Hashimiyya fi Ramallah, which is in the middle of the town there. And after that, I got a one-year scholarship to go to a Quaker school in Pennsylvania. It was called the George School in Newtown, Pennsylvania. And I attended school there. And after that, I got a scholarship to Oberlin College. And in 1974, I graduated from college and started working. And I've been working ever since 1974.
So when you mentioned getting a scholarship and coming to the U.S. from Palestine, I was hoping to hear a little bit about that transition to the United States. What was that like, or what did it feel like to sort of leave home, what I assume felt like home to you, to come to the United States?
Well, it was challenging. First of all, I arrived in Chicago on a flight that started in Palestine, and it was the 2nd of June, 1969, and the United States was going through a lot of social turmoil at the time. The first thing that struck me is they had big thunderstorms and a lot of rain in June. I had never seen rain in June in my whole life. So that blew my mind. The thunderstorms were so big, I almost wanted to go home. And then I remember going a couple of days later, going to, walking around the streets. I wanted to eat, to go to a restaurant. You read the menu, you can't really tell heads from tails. And I ended up ordering something. And then when I went back to, I was staying with one of my brothers there in Chicago, and they told me, "You ate pork. You didn't know what you were doing." I said, "Oh, no." So I found out this old English I've been studying like for 7 or 8 years back home. It didn't really amount to much because I had trouble understanding what people were saying. And I had trouble talking, and I'd go to want to buy an ice cream cone or something. I wouldn't know what to tell, how it is. And one time I was waiting for a bus to go to Branford, Connecticut, and I saw a sign that says N.O. Branford, and I thought it says there's no Branford here. I didn't realize that was North Branford. So eventually, going to school wasn't really easy, as a foreign student that speaks different language and has different culture. The kids would make fun of you sometimes. They tell you about the camels and the tents and all these things. But, took all that in stride and kept my nose to the grindstone, as they say. And I studied hard and managed to, get through the last year of high school. And I got into a very good college, and there were 15 students from my high school that applied to the college. I was the only one who got accepted out of the 15 people, and there was one other person who made the wait list. Again, that's all, the Palestinian parents in the back of your head with a whip,
No, I mean, we were actually talking about this yesterday when we had a conversation about this idea of Palestinians being overachievers, feeling as if they have to go above and beyond, almost to prove themselves. Was it something that you were doing to honor your parents, or did you feel like you had to do it because you had this amazing opportunity in the States?
Well, I think, first of all, in our family, I should really say that I'm the 11th child. I have 3 sisters and 7 brothers. And when I was born in 1951, I was the 11th child, actually. Wow. And I really was wondering what was going in our parents' heads. Like, you have 10 children, you lost everything you had, you lost all your belongings from Palestine. You don't have enough food to eat for more than like 20 days or so. Right. And then you decide to bring another child to the world, That doesn't make sense to me, but, I'm glad they did, and here we are, growing up was kind of really difficult. I remember going with my brothers to the UNRWA distribution center in downtown Ramallah, which is, we call it Ramallah Tehta, and standing in line and having our rations card, Kart al-Mu'an, and waiting for them to give us flour and sugar and rice and oil and soap and a few other things, and then getting somebody with a donkey to carry the stuff all the way to our house. And this was like a monthly ritual. I've kind of seen that a lot. That's one of the memories I have. And once a year, you go and stand in an even longer line, and some guy there from the back of a big truck, when your turn comes, will throw a big bundle of clothes at you, like a bale of clothes. We call it bukja in Arabic. And then you take that home and open it, and it's like potluck clothes. So sometimes you get coats, sometimes shoes, sometimes jackets and shirts. These are kind of secondhand clothes that Americans and other Europeans have donated to Palestinians. So the UNRWA was really our source of sustenance, and it still is for hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians. And that's the agency that Mr. Trump has cut $200 million from its budget, which is kind of unbelievable, and it's kind of inhuman. How could anybody do that when that agency is supporting so many people and educating 500,000 children each year? I just can't understand that. Anyway, so this kind of gives you an idea of where I grew up. I grew up in Al-Birah and Ramallah, so I knew every inch of the city, because we had a lot of things to do, nothing much to do, and especially during the summer and after school. So we'd go to play ping pong and play billiardo. We used to hang out the billiardo in Ramallah.
Were you good?
Yeah. I'm an ace ping pong player, and it actually carried through to my tennis game. Yeah. So now I'm a good tennis player. I have a very nasty backhand slice. It all comes from ping pong, and I have a big serve that comes from ping pong as well. But most importantly, very, very fast reflexes at the net, because in ping pong you have to have really good reflexes. So
there's something about Palestinians and ping pong. My dad's a pretty good ping pong player too.
Yeah,
that's probably what you all grew up with.
Yeah, because we go out of school and we have like 3-4 hours to kill, and we don't want to study, of course, after school, and then we'll go hang out at those places. And so in Ramallah was the greatest place to really is to go on Shara al-Idaa, which is the broadcast street. And Shara al-Idaa, everybody would hang out, watch the girls go by and all that. And it was the place to see and be seen. And while you're walking around there, you could look west and you could see the Mediterranean Sea, especially early in the day before it gets hazy in the evening. And you could see Jaffa, and you could see Tel Aviv. You see the high-rise buildings from there while you're walking around the street. And that walking around, in Arabic, we call it kazdara, yani bikazdar al-wahad. That was a great pastime. We used to pass, Funduk Harb, which is the Harb Hotel, and Qasr al-Hamra. And our house was very close to Al-Markaz, which is the Muqata'a. And it was right near the broadcast towers in Ramallah. So these are some of the memories we remember. Now, in the 60s, there was a lot of late 50s and 60s. There was a lot of political turmoil in the Middle East, and the people in the West Bank, they were all pro Nasser, and then we used to have go out in demonstration for Nasser and all that. And the King Hussein would send his Bedouin troops, and they chase us with big sticks, and we throw rocks at them, and then they catch anybody, old people in the street, and make them pick up all the rocks we throw in the street, and they were humiliating everybody. And at one point, they would fire at us, and then we would just hide and run away, and they'd chase us and all that, and then they'll declare curfew and all that. So we had quite a bit of activities in that area in the early to mid 60s. Now, in 1967, we had the 6-Day War started, and we were in Ramallah. We were able to kind of see what's going on and hear the shelling and the bombardment. I was living downtown on top of Al Aryan Pharmacy, across from Al Hisbeh, and we would go on the roof and look, and we could see the bombs exploding in the Jerusalem area, and we also saw a lot of bombing and napalm bombs going off near the Nebi Samuel, which is a hill near Jerusalem there. And everything was kind of far from us at that point. That was the first day, which was a Monday, I believe. Now, Monday night, we could hear the bombing going everywhere. On Tuesday morning, like around like 7:30, all of a sudden, the bombs exploded behind our building, and we could hear the fighter planes strafing some areas in Ramallah and Al-Dire, and you could just hear the bullets whistling by. And from that point, the town was being shelled by Israeli troops, and by Tuesday night, all the Israeli tanks and cars came in, and as they drove through the city, they shot up every window in the city that they drove by. And our house was downtown, and we wanted to get out of there, like people are used to getting out of the town whenever the Israelis come in. So we started walking, and after a while, my mother was elderly, and she couldn't really walk far, and my father wanted us to keep going. And as we hear some of the bombs go off, and I would grab my mother and pull her down and have her get out of the way. And eventually we decided we're not going to go anywhere. So we were close to a house of friends of ours, a gentleman by the name of Abdelrazak Ode Abaouni, who was an engineer, Mohandas Mamari, and we were related to, we're from the same hometown in Palestine. So they invited us to stay with them. So we stayed in their basement, and that night, Tuesday night, the Israelis went through the city and created a lot of havoc and destroyed a lot of cars and damaged a lot of the buildings. Now, Wednesday morning, we woke up and everything was quiet, so we went back to our place. And that was the end of the 6-day war for us. It was basically a 2-day war in Ramallah.
Thank you for sharing those memories. I know it's difficult to recount these things. I wonder how it is that you and your family then picked yourselves up and continued with your life after these events that happened.
Well, I mean, we were kind of just used to all that stuff. Instead of throwing rocks at the Jordanian army, we now started throwing rocks at the Israeli army. And I remember we were in school one time, and there was an Israeli bank that was set up right next to Cinema Walid inside the Liyat Yafa, and that was called Bank Leomi. And somebody threw a hand grenade at that inside the bank, and it exploded. And then the Israelis went crazy, and they declared curfew, and we were at school at the time, and they told us we can leave school and go home. And as we were walking home, about 20 minutes later, a big Israeli truck came by and stopped us and they put us in the back of the truck, and they took us to the right next to our Hashemiyah school there. And there was a health clinic there. We used to call it Sahiyya in Arabic. And it had a yard behind it, and they had the Israelis had turned that into a police station. And so they put us in a big yard. There was about like 1,500, 2,000 of us there, all young kids, and they kept us there for 10 hours. And eventually it got really dark, and they took us one by one, and they took our names and where we lived and all that. And eventually they let us go, one person at a time, after they had us sitting in the sun for 10 hours. It was mainly just humiliation and to teach us a lesson. It was basically straight collective punishment. None of us were involved in that incident, obviously. 2,000 people had nothing to do with what happened, but 2,000 people got punished. And we learned early on that we were dealing with people who were totally different, and they lack any element of humanity. And as you can imagine, things got a lot worse from there till now by multiples of magnitude.
Yeah. And in terms of as we talked about a little bit before, your transition to the United States, did you feel like you were Palestinian here in the United States? Did you feel like you held on to that identity, or was it difficult to hold on to that identity here in the States?
I did hold on to the identity, and I did feel I was a Palestinian. And I really never tried to hide that or try to change my name or anything like that. People ask me, where you're from? I say, I'm from Palestine. And someone that says, yeah, you're from Israel? I said, no, it's Palestine. There's a big difference between the two. And a lot of people didn't really get it. So I never really felt any direct discrimination or anything because I was a Palestinian. There might have been some things, more subtle things that I wasn't aware of, but I was proud of who I am and who I was. And I didn't really give anybody an opportunity to discriminate against me because I'm very forceful and I'm not the kind of person who would take anything like that sitting. Really, after being in the U.S. for many years, I think you kind of, you're still really a Palestinian, you feel the identity, but you're so distant from there and you haven't been there in a long time. And after a while, you kind of get into what I call is like the cultural no man's land. Like you're like, you're neither in Palestine, neither you're 100% full-blooded American. You're kind of in between, half and half, and you kind of struggle with your identity a little bit, and you kind of feel distant from Palestine, and that's really what happened to me until recently when I really got back into things and started having much closer relationships with Palestinians and with Palestine.
Were you able to travel back to Palestine after your college years, or did you pretty much stay here?
Well, I would have, but I didn't have any money. I was doing college, and the scholarships they give you barely covers like tuition, and you really have to scrounge enough just to get by. And in the summer, you have to get a job and work to, so there wasn't really enough money until I started working. And even then, my work for the first few years, the wages were very meager and they weren't really that lucrative. And I was trying to also send some money to my parents who really still needed money. They were getting on with age, and they were kind of elderly. And they moved to live with one of my brothers, and my other brothers were trying to help as well. And really, the thing that saddens me the most is that I eventually became very successful in business and did a lot of entrepreneurial work. But my parents didn't really live long enough to see that. That's really the part that I regret. They had a very hard life being, after they left Palestine. And it was, they had a lot of anguish for how they lost their land, how they lost everything. And they became people without land and without home, without anything. And that anguish really continued with them for the rest of their life. And really, that was really the hardest part for us as children to see our parents kind of suffer through that phase and through that anguish. So that's really, I remember that when in 1968, after the Israelis moved in and took over the West Bank, we obviously were able to travel to Palestine. So I went one day with my parents and a driver who was a friend of ours, a taxi. So he took us to our village, Salama, and I've heard about back home and Leblad, and all this stuff all my life from all these people, from my parents and from my older brothers, and all the people were talking about how beautiful it was, how good. So we decided to go and see, and we got in the village. And first of all, my parents had a tough time figuring out where everything is because a lot of the homes were gone. There was nothing left but kind of a religious site. It was called Sidi Salama, which is kind of it was a waqf. And the Israelis had kind of cordoned it off and put barbed wire around it and declared it a religious site. It was preserved. And so my parents walked around for 5 or 10 minutes, and then they decided they wanted to leave. They didn't want to stay. They just couldn't really take it. they could not bear the fact that they're in their village and somebody else has their house and their property, and they did not want to be any part of it. So we got back in the taxi and we left like 10 minutes after we were there. And I didn't understand it at that point. But now that I think about it, I could just see, how difficult it was for them to see that and could not bear being there. Like they were, obviously they wanted to see what it looked like because they longed to it. And that longing, was very, very strong. Yet when they saw it, it was something that they just could not handle, they could not deal with, and they wanted to go. So,
well, I appreciate you sharing these emotional moments and thoughts and memories with us. And I know I can speak for myself. I think you've done your parents very proud with everything you've accomplished in your life and what you, as you mentioned, are doing for Palestine nowadays. Perhaps we can transition a little bit into that work, thinking about that time period of sort of separation from home, separation from Palestine. Was that the time that you were raising your family? Was that an intentional thing that happened? Sort of what was that period like, and what brought you back to Palestine?
Well, initially I was, going to school and I was working. I was really very lonely because, as you know, when you live in Palestinians have very close-knit families, and especially if you're a boy, a male, your mother kind of cuddles you and kind of spoils you so much, and so you just get used to a very doting mother, and that takes care of you and overfeeds you all the time and wraps your stomach before you go to bed when you're a baby and you're a kid. So to the point like, I go to the beach, and if my stomach is not covered, I get sick right away. And if I go in a place with air conditioning, I have to put a sweater on because my stomach gets cold because my mother wrapped me so much when I was a kid, so I don't get sick. So I try to explain that to my wife, and they just eventually my wife understands it, but nobody else gets it. Anyway, being in the U.S. and you're on your own, it does get lonely. Really, you miss your family. You miss all these people who would just knock at the door and come into your house and visit, without an appointment or anything. Or I used to tag along with my mother when she goes to visit her friends when I was a little kid, and I sit there, and then the mother of the house we're visiting would bring out a piece of khubz taboon, and with a big piece of white cheese and give it to me, and I eat it. I had a great time. That food tastes so good. That khubz taboon and the white cheese. That's so good. And I would sit there with my mother and listen to all of these Palestinian women talk back and forth and drink coffee and read the coffee, the coffee cups. And so I got good at reading coffee cups. I can read somebody's coffee and tell you're going to get a letter in 5 days, 5 months, or 5 years, or whatever.
Exactly what the letter says.
And you have Takat Faraj, and you have to travel, and there's a bed, but it's white, and you're gonna get sick and do better. And there's this little snake that somebody is really after you. You have to be careful. You got an enemy there, and then you have a couple of dogs. These are the friends that are trying to help you. So this whole there's a whole culture around reading, coffee. And I remember in our house, there were a couple of, misfortunate ladies used to come and visit, where my mother will give them some food and slip a couple of piastres to them to help them out. And these women were like, they would come and tell you what's going on, like in town. So they were like part of the informal media. But the biggest media was at the oven, the forum. This is where mostly the women bring in the dough that they prepared at home so they can bake it and make bread for their families. And that place was almost like the United Press International or the Reuters International. You can go there everything gets broadcast there. So it's like it's like having all these talking heads on CNN, except it was a lot more interesting.
So that was sort of this moment and these moments that you had with other people all the time, surrounded by family, surrounded by friends, surrounded by people.
And this is the part that you really miss in the U.S. I can't go to somebody's house and knock on the door and he says, "Hey, I'm coming to visit you. How are you doing today?" People will laugh at you here. So you have to call like 6 weeks ahead of time, make an appointment. All that. Well, what's the fun in that? Back home, people just do things without planning. And sometimes that's really good. You get tired of planning everything. I like to do things at the last minute. I don't like planning myself. So in business, I didn't do much planning, and I did fine. In fact, I did better than the people who did a lot of planning.
So bringing it back then, what sort of brought you back to Palestine? What sort of made you feel less lonely here in the United States?
Well, I eventually got by, so it's not a problem. Really, just going back to the story of the museum and all this, I was in the country for a long time, for 40 years, almost 49 years now. And I spent most of that time really working, and I didn't get involved in any of the political things. We get involved with a lot of the Palestinian things. I had seen a bunch of things I could have gotten involved with, but I really didn't like any of those things, and I was uncomfortable participating in some of the stuff because I thought some of it was misdirected, and the people doing it didn't know what they're talking about, and they could not articulate things. And so I kind of waited. After a while, I sold my main business that I had, and I had some extra time. And a few years after that, I was kind of thinking, well, really, it's time for me to really do something for Palestine now that I have a little bit more time. And so as part of that effort, I ran into a couple of people in Washington who were trying to start a museum. So I joined with them as a member of the board, and I kicked in some money, a contribution. And then a couple of months later, working with them, it became very clear to me I'm not going to really have a good time with that group. I had a lot of disagreements over how the business should be run, and I've had 30 some years of entrepreneurial experience running businesses and starting businesses. I didn't think the group had really what it takes to be successful, and the people wanted to pay salaries like from day one before anything was done, and I didn't really think it's fair to ask people for donations and then pay yourself a salary with the donations. But the biggest showstopper for me was the fact that they wanted to dilute the Palestinian story. They did not want to talk about, the injustice. They didn't want to talk about all the bad things that happened to the Palestinians because they didn't want to upset some of the people in the U.S. who might not like that, and they didn't want to come across as being kind of militaristic or too aggressive in our views. And I just felt like, you cannot dilute the Palestinian story. The Palestinian story is the Palestinian story. The Palestinians had injustice done to them, and they have suffered horrible things. And there were massacres, the Deir Yassin massacre, the Kfar Qasim massacres. These things, people need to know about these things. We're not going to sit back and hide stuff like that and pretend nicey nice and as if nothing happened, so that a particular government institution would give us a grant so we can start a museum. Well, that isn't going to work in my book. So I suggested that we use the key, which represents the right of return, as a symbol, and that was turned down, vehemently. And at that point, another person, part of the group, and that person is Randa Bassem Serhan, who is a professor at the American University in Washington. The two of us decided to leave company, and after that I decided to start a whole brand new organization and I want, and this time, I had nobody else to answer to, and I could develop that organization and create a mission for it that really reflects what the Palestinians are thinking, and that organization can then tell the Palestinian story in its most industrial strength version, without having to dilute anything, without having to soft pedal some of the concepts and some of the Palestinian principles, and without making any of these compromises. So about June of 19, June, we got all talking about 19. June of 2017, which is about a year ago, I started working on the concept of creating a museum. And the first week of June, I registered a domain name, which is Palestine Museum U.S. And then I created a nonprofit corporation in the state of Connecticut. And then I began making my contacts with a lot of people and started talking about the museum. About 10 months later, the museum opened its doors April 22nd, 2018. And we had 150 Palestinians attend the opening ceremony, and we had several international media networks covering the event, and the launch of the museum has been a great success. The mission of the museum consists of two main objectives. One, we want to create an institution that the Palestinians can call it their own, an institution that Palestinians can be very proud of, and can feel at home when they walk through the doors. Second, we want to tell the Palestinian story through art and artistic expression and cultural activities to the American audience in particular, and the Western audience in general. For many years and for a long time, the Western media has painted the Palestinians in a very negative way. They have cast us as terrorists. They dehumanize Palestinians. So to really begin telling the Palestinian stories to the West in general, and to the Americans, all we have to do first is to prove that we are human. If we can prove to the Americans that we are human, that's a huge step in that direction, because they've been told by the media that we're not human. So the museum's mission is to really tell that Palestinian story, to show that Palestinians are just like other people. They're human. They have artists that excel. They have musicians. They have sculpture, people that can make sculptures. And they have poets, and they have writers. And we are displaying all of those things, and also we have a long culture, a long time standing culture, and we have a heritage of things like the embroidery, the dresses, which we are displaying and showcasing here in the museum. So this museum has about 90 paintings belonging to almost 30 Palestinian artists. We have Palestinian designers that design fantastic things, including the logo of the museum, which was designed by an 87-year-old Palestinian designer. His name is Raji Cook. And Raji worked in the advertising world for many, many years, and he used his talent, his advertising talent, to create designs that communicated the Palestinian story and what happened to the Palestinians. And one of his best designs is displayed here in this museum behind this wall, and it's an ammunition box that has stones in it, really to highlight the asymmetry of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. The Palestinian children throw rocks at the Israelis shoot live bullets at the children. And what a display that he created, that you look at it and it gives you that whole imagery in 5 seconds of looking at that box. And that's an amazing work of art. And there's nobody that comes to the museum that doesn't ask about what that thing is. And I could tell you, all the media, all the TV networks from around the world that came here went straight to that thing and highlighted that to their audiences.
And so how can people find out more about the museum? Where can they find out more? How can they visit?
Well, the museum has a website that has basic information about the museum on it, and the address and the hours. Also, we have a lot of information on our Facebook page, Palestine Museum U.S, and we also publish a lot of posts on Instagram, again, Palestine Museum U.S. In addition to that, we have cultural events that are planned on a regular basis. For example, tomorrow we have 2 events. The first event, we have a speaker from Palestine, Vivian Sansour, who is involved with a project to revive the heirloom Palestinian seeds for agriculture. And there is now the Palestinian Seed Library that holds these seeds and make them available to Palestinians to farm the land and plant new plants using these seeds that have been restored. After that event, we have a musical concert at 3 o'clock tomorrow. And that concert is led by a Palestinian artist. Her name is Layal Shaker. She's a world-renowned violinist. And she has an ensemble of 4 other musicians with different instruments: piano, viola, percussion, and a bass. And we have over 100 Palestinians and Americans coming to attend that concert and enjoy Palestinian music. So we have several events like that planned during the next few months as well. So we welcome any Palestinians as well as Americans to come and experience the museum. We're open Sunday afternoons from 1 to 5. Most of the people that come to the museum drive from other locations, since this local area is not very large. So we have people that drive from Boston, people that drive from New York and Brooklyn. They come from New Jersey, from Philadelphia, from Washington, D.C., and everybody comes here. The Palestinians that come here find this an amazing place. They can't believe when they walk in the feeling they get of walking into the first Palestinian museum in North America and South America. They can't believe how good it feels to be in a place that's dedicated to Palestinian arts, where you are Palestinian, where you're the primary audience and the primary attention is paid to you. There isn't any other place in the United States that gives you that feeling. So this is an amazing place, and we've been sharing some of the feelings of the Palestinians as they come here, and how they feel and what they experience. Now, our audience and visitors have been running 50% Palestinian origin, and 50% Americans. And the Americans that come here find this place very, very informative, and they find it gives a very strong message. Some of them, we have, for instance, there is a section of the museum where we're exhibiting art that was drawn by Palestinian children in Gaza in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 war there, that the Israelis called it Operation Cast Lead. And the children, as part of their therapy, were asked to draw what they saw during the war. And we have Americans that come there and cry as they watch these paintings and these drawings. And they say, children shouldn't even know about these things, much less see them. And so we feel that the mission of the museum is really being brought to reality, that we are gradually changing the discourse from talking about political things and political conflict to really talking about art, talking about culture, poetry, literature, embroidery, we are changing the discourse. And gradually, we hope that's going to really prove to the Americans that we are human like everybody else. And we deserve to have the same rights and the same privileges that other people have, rights that we haven't had in over 100 years. We walk around the museum, we see pictures of British troops subduing Palestinian demonstrators. They're unarmed, yet the British are brutally suppressing them, and there is a man lying on the ground, not sure whether he died or was just injured in a bad way. We see the troops harassing Palestinians. These are British troops asking Palestinians to show their IDs and humiliating them, much in the same way that the Israelis do today. So nothing has changed from like 1917 to 2018, 101 years, and the Palestinians are undergoing and suffering the same kind of humiliation day in and day out at checkpoints and places where they have to show their IDs. You know, in the United States, you don't have to show your ID unless there's a reason for you to show your ID. That's the kind of freedom we really need as Palestinians. We want to live the same way that Americans live. We want the same kind of freedoms that exist in the United States. And this museum is about showing how different it is here than it is for Americans. We want Americans to understand that what goes on in Palestine is a whole lot different than what goes on in America in terms of freedoms and rights and privileges. And that's one of the missions that the museum is gradually getting across to people as they walk into these doors.
Thank you very much. And we wanted to thank Faisal for his time, for allowing us to be here in the Palestine Museum U.S. It is an emotional experience to be here as a Palestinian American, and I'm going to get a private tour, which is really exciting, and I will be taking some snaps on Instagram, sharing them on our Instagram story for you to experience the museum if you're not local to this area and unable to visit. I also want to say that this is really a great partnership because Palestinians Podcast also aims to rehumanize Palestinians through storytelling and through spoken word. And we do this not only through the podcast and through episodes on the podcast, but also through live storytelling events. And we really hope that you're able to visit the Palestine Museum U.S. here in Woodbridge, Connecticut. Listen to the podcast, and you can find more information on our Facebook page and on our website. And I also wanted to mention that if you wanted to get involved in this process of rehumanizing Palestinians through either storytelling, through art, through culture, we have many opportunities for you to do that. And one of them is actually our summer storytelling competition. We have a competition for 3 age groups, 9 through 13, 14 through 17, and all adults, to submit an oral story told by you or someone you love who's Palestinian for a chance to be featured on the podcast. And that's just one way for you to get involved in this process of changing the image and changing the way that Palestinians are seen in the mainstream media. So if you have something quick to say before we go, did you want to close with something?
Yes, I'd like to say something in Arabic, if you don't mind.
Sure.
أود أن أشكر مستمعينا في فلسطين في الضفة الغربية وفي قطاع غزة وفي فلسطين قبل 48 المحتلة وفي الأردن وفي سوريا وفي لبنان وفي كافة الشتات. أشكر مستمعين الفلسطينيين الذين دعموا المتحف والذين يؤيدوا أعمالنا هنا في الولايات المتحدة. تحية فلسطين حرة وإلى الأمام.
And with that, we'd like to thank you for tuning in to this live episode of Palestinians Podcast. I'm Nadia Abuelezam. I'm the producer of Palestinians Podcast, and I'd just like to say thank you again for your time, for your hospitality, and we hope that we'll see you again soon at another live event, for a live episode, or even if you're just listening to the podcast. Thank you, and we hope that we get to interact with you again soon. See you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Perfect.
What do you think?
I think it was good. It was a little less. Sorry, let me figure
too
out.
political.
It was a little less interviewy than it usually is,
Yeah.
and maybe a little bit less personal than it usually is.
I threw in some personal stuff.
You did, no, definitely.
And my eyes were tearing.
No, I know. I felt bad that I brought through all these.
No, it's fine. What kind of audience did we get?
And not many people were watching it live, unfortunately.
But now we can post it.
Now we'll post it,
on Facebook. We should get a lot. Now we can share it.